Hi everyone, this is Mrs. GA, and today we're going to learn about two new ways to determine triangle congruence: side, angle, side, and side, side, side. So remember the last lesson we learned how to find angle, side, angle, triangle congruence. So now let's look at this next one, side, angle, side. So it says if two sides and the included angle, included meaning the angle between, of one triangle are congruent to two sides and the included angle of another triangle, then the triangles can be considered congruent. So that's enough to show that they're congruent. So if you look here, I see that side, angle, side are congruent. So that's enough to show that these two triangles are congruent. So let's say I decide to name my first triangle CAB. Let's see if we can match up the corresponding parts. So C is going to correspond with P because the angles are congruent. Now, to figure out which one we go to next, notice from C to A, I crossed over a single dash. So I'm going to do the same in my other triangle. So my next point must be Q, and then R must correspond with B. So you can use congruent sides and angles to determine the corresponding parts. The other type of triangle congruence we're going to use today is called side, side, side triangle congruence. So this says if three sides of one triangle are congruent to three sides of another, then we can determine that the two triangles are congruent. So here, DF is congruent to IH, FE is congruent to HG, and ED is congruent to GI. So this would be side, side, side. So from this information, we could determine that triangle, let's say DEF, is congruent to triangle. So let's see. Angle D is between the single and the triple. Over here, that would be angle I, between the single dash and the triple dash. And then to get from D to E, I go over the triple dash. So to get from I to G, I go over the triple dash. So G must be the corresponding angle to E, and that leaves H with F. So make sure when you're naming the congruent triangles that you list them in the right order, because that does matter. So again, now we know three different ways to prove that triangles are congruent: either angle, side, angle, side, angle, side, or side, side, side. So remember, if it's not one of these three, we cannot at this point determine that they are congruent. So let's look at this first example. So here we have two triangles, and we're given information about their side lengths, but also I see that there's an angle. So let's see if we can determine they're congruent and how. So the first thing that I see is that DE is congruent to GH. They're both 2.5. The next thing that I see is that angle D is congruent to angle G. So I'm looking here, 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 here. And then if I kind of continue along this, like this, the next thing I see is that segment DF is congruent to segment GJ. So if you look at what we have here, we have side, angle, side. So remember, this is enough for us to determine that the two triangles are congruent. So let's see if we can list a congruent statement. So let's say I call the first one EDF. Let's see if we can match the corresponding parts. So I know that E must go with H, D must go with G, so therefore F must go with J. So we have determined using side, angle, side that the two triangles are congruent. Okay, let's look at this next one. So here I see a lot of information about the side lengths. I actually see 3 side lengths here and 3 side lengths here. So here we can say, okay, I see that DH is congruent to FH. They're both 8 centimeters. And I see that EH is congruent to GH. So I see that these are both 20 centimeters. And then I see that DE is congruent to GF. They're both 16. So let me actually do colors for the corresponding sides because it's a little bit hard to tell with all these numbers. And there you go. So you can see here that using side, side, side triangle congruence, we have enough information to determine that these two triangles are congruent. So let's see if we can name the corresponding parts for our congruent statement. So let's say I call the first triangle, triangle DHE. So I see that angle D is between blue and red, so that must correspond with angle F. I see that H corresponds with itself, and then that means that E corresponds with G. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that we could also infer that this angle is congruent to this angle because they are vertical angles. And so we could also actually use side angle side to show that these two triangles are congruent. So we actually have two different ways of showing congruence for this example. Okay, let's look at this last one. So here I can actually, again, show that these two triangles are congruent in two different ways. So let's start by trying angle side angle. So here I see that angle A is congruent to angle D, and then the side next to it, AC, is congruent to DF, and then I see that angle C is congruent to angle F. So using this region here, and that would be angle side angle, I can show that those two triangles are congruent. Notice that I have to use this side. I can't do angle this side and the angle because this is not an included side. So if you want to use angle side angle, it needs to be with these three pieces of information. Another option that we could do, again, is maybe side angle side, because you can see that I have two sides and an included angle. So we could also say that CA is congruent to FD, angle A is congruent to angle D, and AB is congruent to DE. So here, by side angle side, we've shown that the two triangles are congruent. So two different ways to show the same thing. So let's write a congruent statement. Let's say I decide to call my first triangle CBA. Let's see if we can match up the corresponding parts. So I know that C corresponds with F, B corresponds with E, and A corresponds with D. So there's our congruent statement. Okay, let's try a couple more of these. So remember, we're trying to determine if they're congruent, and then we're trying to decide how we know that they're congruent. So let's look at this next one. So one thing you might see right off the bat is that they tell us that these two lengths are congruent. So we know that PS is congruent to RQ. They are both 5 inches. Well, then the next thing I see is an angle, two angles that are congruent. So I can say that angle SPR is congruent to angle PRQ. Remember here, I cannot just call this angle P because this vertex is shared by two different angles. Same thing here. So you need to use 3 letters to name them. So far I have a side, I have an angle. And so we know that if we can show that another side is congruent, then we can use side angle side. Well, if you look, this middle side is actually part of both triangles. So here we could say PR is congruent to itself. And that would be the last part of side angle side. So I've shown that this bottom triangle is congruent to the top one. Let's make our congruent statement. So let's say I call the top one QRP. Let's see if we can match up the corresponding parts. So I know that Q is going to correspond with S. I know that R, this part of my triangle, actually corresponds with this part of my triangle. So P. and that means that P must correspond with R. So again, be careful here. We know that in this bottom triangle, P corresponds with R in the top triangle. Okay, let's look over at this example. So here we have two triangles. This one we're given 2 lengths and an angle. Here we're given 3 lengths and an angle. So I don't have enough information to use side, side, side because I'm missing this side. So I cannot use side, side, side. Here I also cannot use any angle, side, angle, because I only know information about one angle. So let's see if we can use maybe side, angle, side. So can we use side, angle, side? Let's check. So I see here that this side is congruent to this side. So ED is congruent to HG. So that's good. That's the first step of side, angle, side. And then if I'm using the included angle, here's what I see. I see that this angle is 90 degrees and this is 95. So from here, I know that angle E is not congruent to angle H. So that means that I can't use side, angle, side, and therefore there's no way to determine that those two triangles are congruent. So we would say not congruent. Okay, let's look at this last example together. So we are going to try to find the values for, or the value for x that would make these two triangles congruent. So let's see the information we have so we can determine the type of congruence that they're trying to use. So on this side, I see that I'm given a side, something about the angle and a side, and then on this side, same thing, side, angle, side. So it looks like they're trying to use side, angle, side congruence. So the first side, they do show that they're congruent, so that's good. DF. We need to show that angle C is congruent to angle F, and then we see that CB is congruent to FE. They're both 12 inches. So this is what we have to show, or we have to make sure that we use the right x value for this to be true. So again, we want angle C to be congruent to angle F. So angle C is 2x plus 14, and angle F is 4x. So I'm going to subtract 2x from both sides and divide by 2. So if x equals 7, then these two angles are congruent, and then we can state using side, angle, side that these two triangles are congruent. So it's kind of working our way backwards from what we were doing earlier. All right, that is all for today's video. Thank you so much for watching.